Hamish de Brеттon-Гордон is a retired British Army colonel. He was also a commanding officer of the NATO and UK chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear reaction troops. Welcome to the program, Colonel Hamish.
Thank you very much for having me.
If Ukraine does not prevail, the British people will not go to the polling station in November, but to the enlistment centers. That's what you wrote in your recent article for the Telegraph. Does that mean that the prospect of the Third World War is not that far away?
Well, I think what we're trying to say here is that certainly in this country and the European NATO countries, we must absolutely ensure that Ukraine gets everything it needs: ammunition, military capability, fighter jets, air defense assets, in order that Ukraine can prevail and hold the Russians and push them back. Because if we do not, then the UK will have to put boots on the ground in Ukraine and across Europe. And I think there are some people in the UK and Europe who are not entirely focused on what is happening in your country. And it's absolutely essential that people do. We have a general election coming up in the United Kingdom in November, and only recently, in the last few weeks, the political parties have realized how important the UK's defense is and how important it is that we ensure that Ukraine has everything it needs to fight the Russians. Otherwise, we, the United Kingdom, and the other European NATO countries will have to fight the Russians ourselves in Europe. I think anybody who's looking at this in any depth nobody thinks that Putin will stop at Ukraine. He's been telling us now for years that he wanted to re-establish the old Soviet Union. Unfortunately, Ukraine was the first country in his sights, but certainly will be not the last. So it is absolutely key that UK supports Ukraine with every military capability that we have.
But do you feel that the British people are ready to fight Russia in Europe?
No, I don't think they are. I think a lot of British people are focused on other things: the cost of living crisis, the price of gas at the petrol pumps, the climate change, and a whole host of other issues. And particularly, I think the younger people in Britain who do not remember the Second World War or other wars we've been involved in are really not understanding the gravity of the situation in Ukraine, which is why it's up to people like myself. And I spent the last 35 years of my life on the battlefields of the world, and I know how dreadful they are. But people in Britain need to understand that as well, and absolutely lean into Ukraine and the support to Ukraine, because they might want to fight and they might, want to do other things. But, if Russia prevails in Ukraine, then they will have to fight in Europe. So it's essential that they realize now that giving everything we can to Ukraine is essential in order that the Russians are turned back.
In your recent interview for the Times Radio, you said that the UK Air Force can easily shoot down Russia's drones and missiles in the international airspace near Ukraine. How could it be even possible from a military point of view?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think at the moment the UK is thinking about putting British military boots on the ground in Gaza to help with aid. And a few weeks ago, British fighter jets, along with American, Jordanian and French, shot down Iranian missiles and drones that were fired at Israeli civilians. So myself and others are asking the British government what is different with Ukraine. Why can we not shoot down Russian missiles and drones that are fired from Crimea with UK fighter jets based in the Black Sea, which is international airspace, the most of it. And I think we're also saying, these missiles and drones, most of them are fired at civilians in Ukraine. Why can't British fighter jets and other NATO jets be used to knock them down? Because if Russian drones and missiles knocked down and become ineffective, then the balance will hopefully be tipped more in Ukraine's favor, and they should prevail. So I think it is possible, although I'm not a fighter pilot, I think it is possible to fire these missiles not in Russian airspace and probably not even over Ukraine. But I think we should seriously look at it. I don't see what the difference is between Israel and Ukraine. This is to protect civilians, and if we do it, hopefully less civilians will be killed in Ukraine.
But is this military option even on the table of the British Prime Minister?
Well, certainly not in public. It's on the table. I'm sure that military planners are looking at every eventuality, which is what you do. And it strikes me and others who are looking at this that this is something that Britain and its NATO allies could do, having boots in the air, if you like, rather than boots in the ground, firing. And some of these missiles are fired from, tens, if not hundreds of kilometers away. So I think it is possible. Hopefully it is being looked at. We're well aware that the F-16 fighter jets should be operational in Ukraine in the fairly near future. And one of the key things that Ukrainian forces need on the ground is air power in the air that is protecting them, which they haven't had yet throughout this conflict.
Don't you think that such boots in the air, as you said, can easily change the course of the war?
Well, hopefully it could change the course of the war very much in favor of Ukraine. Now, I know that a lot of people in this country are worried that it would provoke Putin further and get us more heavily involved. But since day one of the conflict, since the 24th of February 2022, Putin has been threatening the UK with nuclear attack. Now, that just hasn't happened because Putin knows that if he threatens nuclear, ourselves, the UK, the US and France would be able to respond with much greater capability. So, yeah, I know people are concerned that it might get Britain more deeply involved in this conflict. But if we don't do these measures and Ukraine doesn't prevail this summer and into the winter, then we may have no option. So it is essential always to try and defeat your enemy as far away from you as possible. So from a UK perspective, to me, it makes a lot of sense. There are dangers to it, of course, but we're living in a very dangerous world at the moment.
Do you feel that there could be such political willingness to do so even in the future?
Well, we shall see. The defence of the UK and support to Ukraine is becoming a much bigger issue in the UK at the moment, particularly as politicians start to look towards the UK elections, which will probably be in November this year. And as our original gambit when we started this, there is, if things go really, really badly, Britain might be preparing to help fight with Ukraine on the ground come November. But if we support Ukraine as much as we can now, potentially using our fighter jets to knock down Russian drones and missiles, then we might prevent that, and the Russians may be turned. But I think we have to prepare for all eventualities. The threats around and the threats to the United Kingdom are probably greater than they've been since the end of the Second World War. And this is the most important thing that our politicians must do. First of all, as far as the UK is concerned, protect the United Kingdom. And secondly, to protect our allies. And Ukraine is one of our most important allies at the moment.
In your numerous interviews and articles, you have been urging the West to provide Ukraine with gas masks. You have been saying that Russia has been deploying a chemical weapon, CS gas. What is your take on that?
Well, yes, this has been a development over the last few months in Ukraine and actually over the last 12 months. I hadn't realised quite how extensive it was. Both the UK's Daily Telegraph and Reuters news agents did an investigation, and it would appear the Russians are using CS gas, sometimes called riot control agent, numerous times on the front lines. And it is illegal under the Chemical Weapons Convention to use this type of gas. and it's very unpleasant. And if you don't have a gas mask, you can't breathe. And there are lots of stories about Ukrainian soldiers having to get out of their trenches. And when they do that, of course, the Russians then attack. The simple way to get over this is to make sure that Ukrainian soldiers have gas masks that are effective. I understand at the moment they predominantly have very old ones. So myself and others have been urging the British government to provide new modern gas masks, which would make the CS gas not such an option on the front line. But I've seen this in Syria, the Russians and the Syrian regime using toxic chemicals to great effect. But it is illegal under the Chemical Weapons Convention and also under the Geneva Convention. It is a war crime and the Russians should be called out for it. But there is a simple way to help the Ukrainian soldiers overcome it. And unless we call them out and unless we get those gas masks to the Ukrainian front line, Russia will continue to use it because it is effective. And I think if you have no morals or scruples, which the Russians don't, they'll use these type of dreadful weapons all the time.
If Russia uses chemical weapons, don't you think that the West should provide Ukraine with not only the means to defend itself, but only with the means to fight back and even counter such chemical threats?
Absolutely, I do. I think, first of all, we must give personal protection to Ukraine, predominantly gas masks, and then the missiles to be able to take them out. I personally know from the Russians, having seen them support the use of chemical weapons in Syria. I'm talking to you from a city in the UK called Salisbury today, where the Russians attacked some British people with chemical weapons back in 2018. So it's very personal to us. But these are illegal weapons. They should not be used, and the Russians should be called out for using them. And those Russian units that are using them, we should ensure that Ukraine has the right way to strike back in order that these weapons can't be used in future.
US Congress has finally approved more than $60 billion in aid for Ukraine. From your perspective, how could this big aid package from the US could influence the situation on the ground in Ukraine and the capabilities of the Ukrainian army?
Well, hopefully it'll have two effects. First of all, a psychological effect, making sure that Ukraine once again has enough ammunition to be able to hold back and push the Russians back. And from what I understand, that has been an issue over the last few months with lacking of artillery shells and other ammunition. So and I understand the Americans are already delivering some of that equipment. We understand that the latest form of ATACMS, which is a long-range precision-guided missile, is also being providing. And again, this could allow Ukraine to attack deep into the Russian rear areas to cut off their supplies to the front line. So I think it's a demonstration from the US that they are absolutely still behind Ukraine. All that vital ammunition that is so desperately needed will get through. And I think at the same time, Britain announced £500 million worth of ammunition as well, including the Storm Shadow missiles, which are another long-range precision missiles that are having great effect. And the more of those I'm sure that Ukraine has, the more effectively it can fight off the Russians. So I think this is a big moment. Everybody would have hoped that it came 6 months ago at least, but we are where we are. Hopefully it's moving forward and it will boost the morale of Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian civilians who are opposing this dreadful Russian invasion.
President Zelensky said that Ukraine has not yet received all necessary weapons from the United States. From your perspective, how quickly could the US provide Ukraine with all those important weapons from this package?
Well, I don't know the full detail of it, and I'm sure the president knows a lot more than I do. I think I understand the Americans have pre-positioned quite a lot of this weaponry in Europe ahead of the vote. And it's in everybody's interest to get it to Ukraine as quickly as possible. So I'm sure that people like myself and others are impressing on our governments to make sure that this gets as quickly as possible. And with the perceived or the potential for a Russian offensive in the summer, it can't arrive a moment too soon. So it seems to be going forward. We're all hoping it's going forward. And let's make sure that our governments do all they can to ensure that it gets to the right places at the right time.
You also mentioned about the aid from the United Kingdom. How could this aid influence situation on the ground, and what package would be the most important for Ukraine war effort?
Well, I think it has two effects. Hopefully, it also encourages the other European NATO countries to match the aid that's going forward. I think of particular importance is the Storm Shadow missiles that have been so effective, and hopefully encourage the Germans to do likewise and give their long-range missiles. That has been a bit of a gap at the moment. But I think I'm sure, as a soldier myself, every little helps. And the worst thing is going into battle short of ammunition of all types. And the British support and the American support will hopefully make sure that the Ukrainian soldiers have the right amount of ammunition to fight off the Russians this summer.
U.S. official told AFP that U.S. aid for Ukraine could help Ukraine to bring back the initiative on the ground. What do you think about this possibility?
Well, let's hope that's the case. I think, although that there is a lot of pressure on the front lines at the moment, that there is hope for optimism too, I believe. The American aid coming in is hugely significant. There is also some of the key equipments like the long-range ATACMS. There is also the more British Storm Shadow coming. And with the F-16 fighter jets really just over the horizon, some of the elements needed to conduct successful ground operations are all coming together. And if Ukraine can get air superiority over the Russians, it'll be more easy for its troops on the ground, its tanks, artillery, and infantry to break the Russian line. So I think there is optimism. We would have wished all this kit came earlier. We assume that the training has been done. Of course, the Ukrainian soldiers have worked so hard and so bravely up till now with this extra equipment. Hopefully it'll tip the balance in Ukraine's favor and allow them to break through the Russian lines this summer.
In the interview in Times Radio, you also said that Ukraine has been successfully forming the battlefield to liberate Crimea. What would it take for Ukraine to do that?
Well, I think that when one looks at tactically the opportunity here, the Ukraine military have managed to defeat the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which is an incredible operation. That gives Ukraine freedom of maneuver in the Black Sea. So with no Russian fleet around, it means that Crimea is sort of open on three sides almost. With the long-range ATACMS, which appear to be doing a lot of damage to Russian forces in Crimea, and with the ground forces supported by the air power that is coming along, the opportunity to break through the lines and sort of dislocate, get behind the Russians in Crimea is there. So, and I think if Ukraine manages to take Crimea, that will be very, very significant and will tip the balance very much in Ukraine's favor. So, we shall see. It seems with all these things coming together now, it's a much more positive aspect than perhaps 12 months ago.
CNN reported that Ukraine could launch another counteroffensive next year. The Washington Post's analyst and columnist said that Ukraine could launch another counteroffensive operation even in the end of this year. What is your take on this time frameworks?
Well, I think there are a lot of experts suggesting what Ukraine could or couldn't do at the moment. The only people who really know that are people in Ukraine, the military in Ukraine and the commanders there. And no doubt they will be having their plans and no doubt they will strike the Russians at the time of their choosing, which they seem to be right. Now, whether that is this summer or this winter or next year, that is entirely up to the Ukrainian High Command. But I'm sure that they have the capability and the desire and the will to do it. And we all hope it's sooner rather than later.
What are the biggest challenges and opportunities for the Ukrainian army in the upcoming months?
Well, I think the biggest challenges are the hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers who are manning the Surovkin line, the defensive line over 1,000 miles, which is an incredibly large area to cover. They seem to have endless ammunition, and the Russians seem to have endless amounts of manpower that they are prepared to throw into what they call the meat grinder. Also, Russian industry seems to be on a total war footing, whereas in the West we are just waking up to the sort of prospect of having to get engaged fully in the war ourselves. So those are the challenges there. The prospects, I think, with some of the positive moves on the military front and the military capabilities coming to Ukraine, that when the Ukraine High Command decide to get back on the offensive, there will be opportunities to do this. But you guys know much better than we do. The war's been going on for well over 2 years now. Desperate casualties, civilian casualties, and military casualties in Ukraine. And I think everybody just wants to try and enable Ukraine and you guys to defeat the Russians as soon as possible. But nobody thinks it's going to be easy.
Thank you, Colonel Hemish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine.
Thank you for having me, and absolutely, Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!